As a business owner, I represent the last line of defense. It might not be my fault, but it's always my responsibility. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Erkka Suvanto. Some of you call me EJ. I'm the guy on social media who wants to build a legacy for his kids and pass on all the life and business lessons to each and every one of you. When we do business, even if I had a one-person company, I wouldn't be doing business alone. Either I have employees, but if not that, there are different stakeholders that do business with me. I partner with companies and with people. All of that is called a value chain, using business terminology, also known as stakeholder matrix. So let's today talk about just that. What kind of dependencies we have as business owners, and what are the potential pitfalls and risks related to that particular model. There are two kinds of ways how you can put together your value chain. You can do it vertically or you can do it horizontally. So let's start by drawing a simple graph. The first picture here represents a vertical business model. So these square boxes are stakeholders. They could be companies, they could be employees. And a horizontal business model looks like this, using the same four squares. This is the horizontal and this is the vertical. If we start by using a very simple example, let's say I live in a warm climate and I run a pool cleaning business. Without looking at whether it's horizontal or vertical, that business model, the stakeholders in that business could be me, as let's say a 1 or 2 person company. Then I have a chemical supplier that provides the chlorine and whatever chemicals I need to put in my customers' pools. And then I have a parts supplier for the pool pump and whatever hardware equipment there is. And then last but not least, potentially using a fourth example, I could use a subcontractor. My business has grown, so I can't handle it all by myself, so I need to outsource some of that work. So that could be an example of a very simple value chain where there are 4 different stakeholders. And then as a business owner, I have 2 options. Either I keep all of those separate companies the way they were in the beginning as their independent units or entities, or I can start acquiring them. If they were their separate entities, that would be a so-called horizontal model. This would be me here, and this would be my parts supplier for hardware, and this could be my chemicals, and this could be the subcontractor, the 4th player. So if I wanted to have a better control of that business, I could say that, yes, okay, instead of using this hardware supplier, if my business justifies, my numbers justify it, I could try to buy this particular business. Or I could try to buy the chemical supplier, or I could try to buy the subcontractor. And the reason why I would do that is that in this case, this would be the same example. Part supplier, me, this is the subcontractor, and then the chemical supplier. So what's the difference between the two? The difference between the two is that if my business model is vertically integrated, like this, I usually have better control of the user experience, and I understand my cost structure better. There's more visibility into the process. And at least in theory, my profit margin could be better because I can control all elements of the cost, and there's no overhead attached to every single step of the value chain. So there are pros and cons. So what is then the complexity related to it? Why wouldn't I do it? Because first of all, I might not have the resources to buy these. It could be the other way around, and most likely it is that the parts supplier or the chemical supplier would actually be a bigger company, so they could be looking at buying me. But forgetting the size, putting that aside for a little bit, the reason why I wouldn't do it this way is that obviously it requires more talent management. I need to be very good at each and every function. I need to invest in equipment. I need to invest in people, potentially in location, in equipment, in my capital expenditures would be much greater. And the business complexity grows. So it's not as flexible anymore when I have so much more at stake and so many more stakeholders in that particular business. Okay, So this was the starting point regarding the whole conversation. So let's now move on and look at some of real life examples, some household names that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, and do the same exact thing, meaning map our value chain. So what is an example of a vertical value chain? That would be Apple. So if we look at Apple's business model, so I'm going to break this down into 5 key tasks or building blocks in the value chain that represent, I would say, 90% of the business. So first, we have the design and the R&D. Second, we have the software. 3, we have manufacturing. 4, we have retail. And 5, we have customer support. Okay? So if we think about Apple, what is Apple known for? They control every single building block, meaning they have internal resources. There are no outside companies, with the exception of manufacturing, where they're using Foxconn and Pekachon as their suppliers, but as their manufacturing suppliers. But even in those cases, Apple engineers are known for being very hands-on with their suppliers. My background is in supply chain management. My last 5 to 6 corporate years were in sourcing, where I was responsible for some of the outsourcing work that the big consumer electronics company that I worked for did with our Asian suppliers. So I'm very familiar with the value chain structure and how to put together contracts, negotiate prices, and talk to these suppliers. So that's why I wanted to bring this background information into this context and apply it then when it comes to my real estate business experience. I'm going to come to those later. But let's first finalize the thought regarding the Apple vertical business model. So design and R&D. So whether it's hardware, software, mechanics, packaging, user experience, it's all in the hands of Apple, their own resources. Software. This would be iOS, iCloud, and so forth. And then manufacturing, this is where they use partnering, but with a very hands-on approach from Apple itself. Retail, as we know Apple retail stores, they own those. And then the customer support, the customer transaction, aftermarket support is Apple owned as well. So the whole idea here, why is it that Apple does it this way, is that they want to control the user experience. This is the whole reason why they do it. And like we discussed a couple of minutes ago, one of the benefits of a vertical business model is that you control the outcome better than in a horizontal model. So you control the cost, there's less overhead. In theory, there's more profit. The quality is better. The visibility into the value chain is better because it's all in your hands. But at the same time, it requires a lot of investments in human capital, in equipment, in all kinds of know-how so that you can actually get something out of it. It takes time to build those processes up. A couple of other examples from here. We could mention Tesla. We could use Amazon. If you think about Tesla, for instance, you could even add raw materials here into the equation. So Tesla wants to control every single building block in the value chain, whether it's procuring the key raw materials, building the batteries, building the electrical motors, manufacturing the cars, doing all the hardware, mechanical and software engineering, all the data that goes into the cars, all the intelligence is in their hands. It's a very, very complex business model, but they believe in the user experience, being able to own the IP and own all the key building blocks so that they control what's seen as the value add in the eyes of the buying customer. Amazon is another example. Amazon has their own cloud services, so they have the user experience as software. They own the warehouses, they own the logistics routes, they have the billing systems in place. So another household example when it comes to vertical integration. Okay, if this is the vertical model, remember this is vertical, and now we move on to the horizontal one. So what is the example there? let's use Microsoft. So Microsoft, first and foremost, they have the operating system, Windows and Office being the products. They control the operating system and the software. What about hardware? This is where they partner. Okay, who do they partner with? This is HP, this is Dell, and Lenovo. So Microsoft doesn't manufacture anything. They don't put together the hardware, the design of the laptops or the computers. It's just their software runs on these devices. Cloud services, key software development in their hands, but they use a lot of partnering, integration when it comes to the corporate clients, and so on, integration. Fourth, distribution. It's online and retail, and OEM as well, original equipment manufacturers. It's not in their hands, it's a joint effort. And then the ecosystem development is again a joint effort led by Microsoft, partnering, and so forth. So the idea here is that, as you can tell, it's a combination of what Microsoft does. So they want to control the key software development, whether it's the operating system or the products themselves. And then they put heavy emphasis on partnering. So when we look at the business model, this is the horizontal business model. And there could be obviously more building blocks. When you have this many stakeholders, there are different entities. Obviously, the supply chain management or the partnership management is a very critical part of your success. The horizontal model makes it possible for you to focus on your own narrow niche, to specialize in that. It doesn't require that much capital expenditures or investments, and it's potentially more flexible. But on the other side of the coin, the flip side of the coin, is that your control when it comes to the user experience and quality is not at the same level as it is with vertically integrated models. And also, at least in theory, your profit margins are not as nice as in the vertical model. But again, we can't directly compare software to hardware because Microsoft is a software company, whereas Apple is doing both. It's doing hardware and software. And software, even though the research and development cost is humongous in the beginning, then the replication cost of that same software close to zero. So the profit margins actually happen to be extremely healthy in their business as well. Let's summarize the pros and cons of both models, the vertical and the horizontal. So if we start with the vertically integrated model, so some of the pros, as we have covered already, is the control of the value chain. So quality is one. When we have all the stakeholders in-house, whether we acquire those companies and have successfully integrated the resources, or then we built the competence up internally, we have better control. And that means lower cost, better quality, and better visibility. And oftentimes, even though we could argue that innovation is a pro and a con, I would potentially say that based on my experience, innovation is actually easier to do most of the time in a very vertically, nicely integrated model. Coming back to these pros and cons, so control cost and profit. So since there is no overhead, there is no separate entities, one doing mechanics, one doing manufacturing, one doing hardware. If we have all of them in-house, we, at least in theory, we can save the overhead part because that's all integrated and there's better visibility and the throughput and the predictability is better. So lower cost, better profit, and the user experience, which is really the highlight of the Apple model. So on the other hand, then it requires heavy investments in brain capital, expertise, equipment, and all of the above. Talent acquisition is hard, whether you hire, train, retain your own talent, or you acquire people. Still, you need to be able to keep them happy and further develop their skills to make sure that you have that competitive edge that you're really shooting for. And it all then boils down to your user experience. Complexity, it's a large organization. It's hard to handle that many resources. It's really hard to make sure that you have laser sharp focus in all of the key competence areas, all of those 5 points that we saw on the previous page. Organization is heavy, and then the flexibility, because of the size of the organization, is sometimes hard to get that flexibility. Then the horizontal model, if we start with the pros here, so the good thing about, if you think about the Microsoft model, where they are focusing on the software, the key product development, the software development there, it gives them very good focus. They are focusing on a more narrow niche as far as the competencies go. And then they also put a lot of focus on integration and partnering work so that the whole ecosystem works. So expertise and focus, as I mentioned, they have flexibility because of their more narrow focus, and then lower capital expenditures, the investments required there in that area. Quality control is worse because you don't have everybody under one umbrella. The user experience is not as easy as it is here. The supplier management, because they are different companies, super hard. I know that I've lived in that world, so to say, and overall the value chain complexity is very hard to keep in control, keep everybody on the same page. So this was what I wanted to highlight regarding the pros and cons of both models. And the point here is that there is no right or wrong. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve and what is the industry that you are playing in. Now to my promised example from my personal life. So when I started my business career 15 years ago, I made a decision to keep my company small. And I'm talking about my real estate development firm now. I didn't want to hire a lot of people. I didn't want to grow my overhead or my complexity. So I wanted to stay flexible and very nimble player in the US market and later on in the Finnish market. And that still applies. When I started doing new construction in real estate here in Finland, I wanted to put together a model where I could combine the benefits from both sides. So my idea was that I would be able to control concept definition of these new housing projects, put together the floor plans, understand what are the materials, what are the key trends in the marketplace that the paying customers would be appreciating. On top of that, I wanted to focus on project management, or I would actually call it contractor management. So choosing the main contractor for the project and making sure that I was the one negotiating the contracts and the pricing and making sure that the train keeps moving in the right direction at all times. I was fully aware of the fact that there were risks involved in this business model, but it wasn't until lately when the real estate market really tanked. The bottom fell off, so to say. So what happened locally here is pretty much what happened in the US in 08, 09 when we had the financial crisis, and that was the time when I started investing in the California market. We didn't have that bad of a price correction, maybe I would say 15 to 25% depending on the market and depending on the city. But nevertheless, the used properties took a pretty big hit. The new construction pricing has stayed pretty flat. And as a result, because the market really tanked and nobody has been really building anything new, a lot of companies have been forced to lay off a lot of personnel. And what happened with my horizontal model was that the main subcontractor that I hired went belly up, went bankrupt. So now we go back to the model, the horizontal model, where every entity is doing its own part of the value chain. And I don't own any of these other players. If my construction guys, if my designers, if my part suppliers, raw material suppliers were all under the same umbrella, I would have better control when it comes to cost and quality. But of course the liability would be bigger as well. I would have more overhead, I would have more people to manage. Again, pros and cons, depending on what you value. So now it backfired on me. Well, stuff happens, right? So this main contractor that I said I used went bankrupt. So now, since I'm ultimately the one responsible in the eyes of the paying customer. Like I mentioned in my intro, it doesn't matter whose fault it is, it's always my responsibility. If my weakest link is no longer there, what does it mean? It means that the customer doesn't care. I can't go back and tell them that, look, yeah, unfortunately there are these warranty issues, but I can't fix them because my contractor is no longer in business. They don't care. I'm the one responsible. So that's something that can happen in real life, no matter what we do. Of course, the same thing could happen in a vertical model, that all of a sudden I acquired another company and wanted to integrate their operations as part of mine. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of employee turnover, we lose the key players, and all of a sudden that function cannot produce what it was intended to do. And as a result, our projects are delayed, they cost more, and the company loses money. All kinds of things could happen. So there are always risks. It's just a matter of what you value at any given time. So now in my case, since my supplier went bankrupt, I'm the one on the hook, and now I just have to deal with the consequences. There hasn't been a big bill to pay yet. I don't know what's down the road, what happens in 1, 5, or 10 years remains to be seen. But this was just an example to highlight that we can put together the value chain or the stakeholder matrix in two different ways. It can be vertical, it can be horizontal. Both have their ups and downs, their pros and cons. It's just a matter of what you personally value. My lesson and my advice to any starting business owner would be to first understand what is your goal. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to build a business that becomes an asset that produces while you sleep, that you potentially sell one day? If yes, I would say a vertical model could be potentially better. Might not be that way, depending on the industry. But the second question I would ask myself is that what are the problems attached to both models? As long as you understand the pros and cons, the risks related to it, you ask yourself what the goal is. Okay, I want to just hold on to this business. I want to turn it into a cash cow, collect a lot of income at the end of the year, or I want to build it into a sellable asset down the road. Then need to understand what is it that this particular market and industry requires. It could be that the premium for a sellable asset is a vertical model. Then that's what it takes. And then just understanding that that vertical model in your industry means X, Y, and Z. There are pros and cons. And then the rest is just execution. There is no right or wrong. Remember, at school we were taught that there's only one right answer in life. But in reality, there are several right answers. There's only one wrong answer, which is to do nothing. As long as you execute, as long as you keep moving forward, you have a chance to pivot, you have a chance to change your model, you can start acquiring different companies or sell off an asset. If, for instance, you are in a vertical model and you decide to niche down and only focus on design and R&D, nobody is saying no to you, or nobody is stopping you from selling some of your assets, or the other way around. If you're in a horizontal model where you start, typically that's the easiest model to start, you can start acquiring assets. You can start building that competence in-house later. So that would be my piece of advice to starting entrepreneurs, to understand the vertical and the horizontal models. And again, there is no right or wrong answer. It just depends on your goal, the industry that you are in, and what you're willing to deal with. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.